Welcome to Dr. Harmony, where we explore the deepest stories of human resilience, the hidden battles of the soul, and the ultimate triumph of justice over arrogance. Today's story is a powerful reminder that the clothes we wear do not define our worth, and the person you look down on today might just be the one who holds your future in their hands. Have you ever been judged solely by the color of your skin or the tools you hold in your calloused hands? Have you ever felt invisible in a place you've poured your heart into for decades? Today, we follow the journey of a woman who was treated like dirt by a man who thought he was a god, only for the world to flip upside down in a heartbeat. Stick with us until the very end because the confrontation in the hospital lobby is something you will never forget. The corridors of St. Jude's Memorial Hospital smelled of antiseptic, floor wax, and the quiet weight of 1,000 stories. For 15 years I had walked these halls before the sun even dared to touch the horizon. My name is Martha, and to most of the staff I was simply the woman with the mop. I didn't mind. There is a certain dignity in cleanliness, a silent service in ensuring that the environment where lives are saved is pristine. I knew every tile, every squeaky hinge, and every exhausted nurse who grabbed a coffee at 3 a.m. I was part of the foundation, or so I thought. I am a black woman who grew up in a time when you had to work twice as hard to get half as far, and I wore my blue uniform with a pride that no one could take away from me. My hands were rough, my knees often ached, but my spirit was unbroken. I had raised a son on this salary, a son who was my world, though I kept my private life very quiet. In a hospital, gossip spreads faster than a virus, and I preferred to be the shadow that kept the place shining. Then came Dr. Julian Vane. He was a young, brilliant cardiac surgeon, or so the brochures said. He was a tall, white man with sharp features and eyes that looked through people rather than at them. From the moment he arrived from a prestigious clinic in the city, the atmosphere in the surgical wing changed. He didn't just walk, he marched, expecting the world to part for him. The first time our paths crossed, I was buffing the floors near the executive elevators. He stepped out, his Italian leather shoes clicking sharply on my wet floor. I had placed the yellow caution signs out, but he ignored them, nearly slipping. Instead of an apology, he turned on me with a sneer that chilled my bones. He looked at my dark skin, then at my mop, and his lip curled in genuine disgust. He didn't see a person. He saw a stain on his perfect environment. He muttered something about incompetence and brushed past me, wiping his sleeve as if the mere air around me was contaminated. I brushed it off. I've dealt with his kind before. Men who think their degrees give them the right to treat the world like their footstool. But Dr. Vane wasn't just arrogant. He was cruel. Over the next 2 weeks, he made it his mission to humiliate me. If he saw me cleaning a break room, he would purposefully knock over a trash can or spill his latte, watching me with a cold, mocking grin as I knelt to clean it up. He started calling me names, not to my face at first, but loud enough for the nurses to hear. He referred to me as the soot in the hallway or the old relic. The other staff looked away, too afraid of his rising star to speak up. They knew he was being groomed for a high-level position. I kept my head down. I kept my dignity. I told myself that his darkness was his own burden to carry. But then came the Monday that changed everything. I was in the middle of cleaning the VIP lounge on the 4th floor when Dr. Vane entered with a group of interns. He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes locking onto me. The air in the room grew heavy. He didn't wait for me to finish. He walked right up to me, invading my personal space, his shadow towering over me. "Why are you still here?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. I looked up, meeting his gaze calmly. "I'm finishing the windows, doctor. It will only take 5 minutes." He laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "No, I mean, why are you still in this hospital? Look at you. You're filthy. Your presence here is an insult to the sterile environment we maintain. You're nothing but a carrier of grime, and, frankly, you don't fit the image this institution is trying to project." The interns shifted uncomfortably, but no one moved. I felt a heat rising in my chest, not of shame, but of righteous indignation. "I have worked here for 15 years, Dr. Vane," I said softly. "I have seen doctors come and go, but the floors stay clean because of me." His face turned a bright, angry red. "Not anymore," he snapped. "I've spoken to administration. Well, I haven't yet, but I am now. I am the lead surgeon here, and I refuse to work in a building that employs people like you. You're fired. Pack your rags and get out before I have security escort you to the curb where you belong." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper, so only I could hear. "People of your kind belong in the streets, not in my sight. Get out of my hospital." He turned to his interns, gesturing to me as if I were a piece of trash. "See this? This is what happens when you let standards slip. Now, let's move on to the pathology report." I stood there, my hand gripping the handle of my mop so hard, my knuckles turned white. He thought he had won. He thought he had the power to erase 15 years of my life with a single breath of hate. What he didn't know was that the administration he was so eager to speak to was about to give him the shock of his life. I stood frozen in the center of the VIP lounge as the sound of Dr. Vane's expensive shoes faded down the hallway. The interns followed him like a pack of loyal hounds, though a few lingered for a split second, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear. They saw the injustice, but in the hierarchy of a hospital, a janitor is at the bottom of the ocean, while a surgeon is the sun. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking, not from sadness, but from a cold, vibrating anger. For 15 years I had been the silent witness to life and death. I had mopped up blood after failed surgeries and tears after tragic news. I had earned my place here through sweat and unwavering reliability. To be told I was filth because of the pigment of my skin and the nature of my job felt like a physical blow. But I didn't cry. I had cried enough in my younger years. Now I only knew how to endure. I slowly began to gather my things. I placed the spray bottle back into my cart and folded the microfiber cloths with methodical precision. My mind was racing. Dr. Vane thought he was the king of this castle, but he was merely a tenant who hadn't read the lease. I thought about my son, David. Every time I thought of him, a warmth spread through my chest that no amount of cold racism could extinguish. David was the reason I woke up at 4 a.m. He was the reason I worked double shifts and took extra cleaning jobs on the weekends. He was my miracle. I remembered him as a little boy, sitting at our small kitchen table, staring at anatomy books that were twice as thick as his torso. He used to tell me, "Mama, one day I'm going to make sure you never have to scrub another floor." I would always laugh and kiss his forehead, telling him that honest work was never a burden as long as it paved the way for him. As I pushed my cart toward the service elevator, I passed the nursing station. Sarah, a head nurse who had been my friend for a decade, looked up from her charts. She saw my face and immediately stepped around the counter. "Martha, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." I leaned against the heavy metal cart, feeling the exhaustion of 15 years suddenly crashing down on me. "Dr. Vane," I whispered. "He told me I'm fired. He called me, well, he said I didn't fit the image of the hospital. He said I was dirty, Sarah." Sarah's face contorted in a mask of fury. She reached out and grabbed my hand. "That arrogant, narrow-minded man. He can't do that. He's a surgeon, not the chief of staff or the HR director. He doesn't have the authority to fire you, Martha." "He thinks he does," I replied, a bitter smile touching my lips. "And in his world, people like him always get what they want." He told me to get out before security threw me out. Sarah began to reach for the phone, her eyes sparking with a protective fire. "I'm calling the administration right now. They need to know what he's doing." I put my hand over hers, stopping her. "No, Sarah. Let it happen. If he wants to go to the top to get rid of me, let him go to the very top. I want him to walk right into the lion's den. Sarah looked at me, confused at first, until she saw the knowing glint in my eyes. She knew about David, of course. She was one of the few who did. A slow, mischievous grin spread across her face. Oh, Martha. He has no idea who he's dealing with, does he? I continued my walk to the basement locker room. The hospital felt different now. The walls I had polished seemed to watch me with sympathy. I passed the cafeteria where I had eaten my humble lunches for thousands of days. I passed the chapel where I had prayed for the patients and for my son's success. Every step felt like a goodbye, but also a preparation for a new beginning. I entered the small, cramped locker room designated for the maintenance staff. It was tucked away in the bowels of the building, far from the gleaming glass and chrome of the upper floors. I opened my locker, number 42. Inside was a small photo of David in his graduation gown from Johns Hopkins, his smile radiating enough light to fill the interior basement. Beside it was a small sealed envelope he had given me 2 weeks ago, which I had kept there for good luck. I took off my blue work shirt. Underneath, I wore a simple, elegant black blouse I had planned to wear to a dinner later that evening. I traded my heavy work boots for a pair of sensible but polished black heels I kept in the bottom of the locker. I wasn't just a janitor anymore. I was a mother, a woman of dignity, and a witness to a crime of the spirit. Just as I was lacing my shoes, the heavy door to the locker room swung open. 2 security guards, men I had known for years, stood there looking uncomfortable. "Martha, we're so sorry," the younger one, Marcus, said. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Dr. Vane called downstairs. He said there was a security risk in the maintenance department and that a terminated employee was refusing to leave the premises. He insisted we escort you out immediately. I stood up straight, pulling my shoulders back. I looked Marcus in the eye. "Is that what he said, Marcus? That I'm a security risk?" Marcus sighed, looking disgusted with his orders. "He was shouting, Martha. Said you were unhygienic and insubordinate. Look, we don't want to do this. We know who you are. We know you've been here longer than he's been out of medical school." I smiled gently at them. "It's okay, boys. You have a job to do. But I'm not going to the exit. I'd like you to escort me to the boardroom on the top floor. I believe there's a meeting scheduled for 2 p.m. regarding the new hospital expansion." The 2 guards exchanged a look of pure shock. "The boardroom? Martha, we can't take you there. That's for the executives and the department heads." I reached into my locker and pulled out the sealed envelope, sliding out a gold-embossed identification card. "Actually," I said, my voice steady and calm, "I think today is the perfect day for a surprise inspection." The air in the elevator felt different as we ascended. Usually when I was in this elevator, I was standing in the corner with a mop bucket, blending into the stainless steel walls while doctors discussed golf scores or complex surgeries as if I were a piece of furniture. But today I stood in the center. Marcus and the other guard, Terrence, stood slightly behind me. They were silent, their eyes darting between the floor numbers and the gold-embossed card I held in my hand. They knew me as Martha who cleaned the spills, but they were beginning to realize that every shadow has a source of light. The elevator dinged as it passed the 3rd floor, the surgical wing. I knew Dr. Vane was likely there, perhaps bragging to his colleagues about how he had finally cleansed the hallway of its most persistent stain. The thought didn't make me angry anymore. It made me feel a strange sense of pity for him. He was about to learn that the foundation of a building is far more important than the paint on its walls. When the doors opened on the top floor, the atmosphere shifted instantly. This wasn't the sterile, frantic world of the ER, or the hushed, sterile hallways of the wards. This was the executive level. The floors were covered in thick, plush navy carpets that swallowed the sound of footsteps, and the walls were adorned with portraits of the hospital's founders. The air smelled of expensive mahogany and success. The receptionist, a young woman named Claire, who usually ignored me when I came up to empty her wastebasket, looked up with a practiced, professional smile that quickly faded into a look of sheer confusion. She saw my black blouse and heels. Then she saw the 2 security guards flanking me. "Martha," she stammered, her voice dropping its polished edge. What are you doing here? And why are the guards with you?" Before I could answer, Marcus cleared his throat. "Dr. Vane ordered an escort for Martha, Claire, but she requested to come here first." Claire looked even more baffled. "Dr. Vane, he doesn't have authority over executive arrivals. And Martha, you know the maintenance staff isn't allowed in the boardroom during the quarterly summit." I stepped forward, placing my ID card on the marble desktop. I didn't say a word. I just let the gold leaf and the official seal of the board of directors do the talking. Claire's eyes widened as she read the name on the card. Not Martha the janitor, but Martha Higgins Vance, honorary board member and primary shareholder of the Vance Medical Trust. Her jaw didn't just drop. It practically hit the desk. Mrs. Vance," she whispered. I had no idea. I am so sorry, It's quite all right, Claire," I said, my voice as smooth as the silk of my blouse. "I've spent 15 years making sure people didn't have an idea. It's much easier to see the true heart of an institution when you're looking at it from the bottom up. Now, is the meeting in session?" She nodded frantically, her hands trembling as she checked her computer. "Yes, ma'am. They started 10 minutes ago. The CEO is presiding." I nodded and turned to Marcus and Terrence. "Thank you, gentlemen. You can return to your posts. If Dr. Vane asks, tell him I am exactly where I need to be." The guards shared a look of pure, unadulterated glee. They were going to have the best story to tell in the break room for the next decade. They gave me a respectful nod, a real one this time, and headed back toward the elevators. I stood before the heavy double doors of the boardroom. For 15 years I had cleaned the brass handles of these doors. I had polished the wood until I could see my own reflection in it. I knew the grain of the oak better than the people who sat inside. I took a deep breath, smoothing down my hair. I wasn't just doing this for myself. I was doing it for every person who had ever been looked down upon, for every worker who was treated as expendable, and for my son, who had worked so hard to honor the sacrifices I had made. I pushed the doors open. The room was filled with about 20 people in expensive suits, all seated around a massive oval table. At the head of the table sat a man in his early 30s, sharp-featured but with eyes that held a deep, soulful kindness. He was mid-sentence, pointing to a slide about the new oncology wing. When the doors swung open, every head turned. The room went silent. My son, David, known to the world as Dr. David Vance, the chief executive officer and head of surgery, stopped talking. His eyes met mine, and, for a second, the CEO mask slipped, replaced by the look of a boy who loved his mother more than life itself. He didn't look confused. He didn't look embarrassed. He looked like he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. "Mother," he said, his voice echoing with a mixture of surprise and warmth. "You're early. I thought you were finishing your shift at 3. I walked into the room, my heels clicking firmly on the floor I used to scrub. "There's been a change of plans, David," I said, looking around the room at the stunned faces of the city's most powerful medical minds. "It seems I've been fired for being filthy." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. David's expression shifted from warmth to a cold, razor-sharp focus that I knew all too well. It was the look he got before a difficult surgery, precise, intense, and lethal to any obstacle in his way. He stood up slowly, his tall frame dominating the head of the table. "Fired," he repeated, the word vibrating with a dangerous energy. "Who exactly in this hospital thinks they have the authority to fire the woman whose name is on the very land this building sits on?" I took a seat in the empty chair at the opposite end of the table. "A new arrival," I said calmly. "A Dr. Julian Vane." He felt my presence was an insult to his sterile environment. He told me I belonged in the streets. The silence that followed was so thick you could have cut it with a scalpel. David looked at his assistant. "Get Dr. Vane up here, right now, and tell him to bring his ego. He's going to need it." The wait for Dr. Julian Vane felt like the slow buildup of a storm. In the boardroom, the air was thick with a tension that made even the most seasoned executives shift in their seats. David remained standing, his hands resting lightly on the mahogany table, but his knuckles were white. He didn't speak, and neither did I. I sat there, my back straight, feeling the strange sensation of the plush chair against my skin. A chair I had dusted hundreds of times but never once sat in. The board members, many of whom had seen me in my blue uniform over the years without ever truly seeing me, looked away in collective shame. They were realizing that the woman who had been emptying their trash cans and wiping their coffee spills for 15 years was the same woman who held the majority voting power of the Vance Medical Trust. Outside the heavy doors, we heard the sound of hurried, confident footsteps. Then, the doors burst open. Dr. Julian Vane marched in, looking slightly out of breath but radiating an insufferable aura of self-importance. He hadn't bothered to take off his white lab coat, which was embroidered with his name in silver thread. He didn't even look toward my end of the table at first. He went straight for David, a wide, sycophantic smile plastered on his face. "Dr. Vance, my apologies for the intrusion," he said, his voice dripping with an artificial sweetness. "Your assistant said it was urgent. I assumed you wanted to discuss the new surgical protocols I submitted this morning. I'm honored to finally have this sit-down with you." David didn't return the smile. He didn't even offer a hand to shake. He just stared at Vane with a look of clinical detachment. "Sit down, Dr. Vane," David said, his voice low and dangerous. Vane blinked, his smile faltering slightly. He looked around the room, finally noticing the grim expressions of the other board members, and then his eyes drifted to the end of the table. He froze. The color drained from his face so quickly, it was as if someone had pulled a plug. He saw me, not in the blue scrubs, not holding a mop, but sitting in the seat of power, dressed in black, watching him with a calm that clearly terrified him. "You?" he gasped, his finger pointing at me instinctively. What is she doing here?" "Dr. Vance, I told you I had this woman removed. She was trespassing in the VIP lounge and—" "Be very careful with your next words, Julian," David interrupted, his voice cutting through Vane's rambling like a surgical blade. "The woman you are pointing at is not this woman. She is Martha Higgins Vance. She is a founding benefactor of this hospital. She is the woman whose personal endowment funded the very surgical wing you were hired to work in. And more importantly," David stepped around the table, his presence looming over the smaller man, "she is my mother." The silence that followed was absolute. I watched Vane's face go from pale to a ghostly gray. He looked at me, then at David, then back at me. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. The realization of the career-ending mistake he had made was crashing down on him in real time. Your mother?" Vane finally managed to whisper. He looked as if he might faint. The arrogance that had defined him just an hour ago had vanished, replaced by a raw, naked panic. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, but found only cold stares. I didn't know. I thought she was just she was wearing the janitor's uniform. She was cleaning the floors." I stood up then, my movements slow and deliberate. I walked toward him, the sound of my heels echoing in the silent room. That's the problem, isn't it, Dr. Vane? I said, stopping just a few feet from him. To you, a uniform makes a person invisible. A certain skin color makes them inferior. You didn't see a human being. You saw a category. You saw someone you thought you could crush without consequence, because you believed I had no voice. Vane began to stammer, his hands shaking. Mrs. Vance, please. It was a misunderstanding. I am deeply committed to the standards of this hospital. I thought I was protecting the professional image of the facility. I didn't realize who you were. If I had known... I held up a hand, silencing him instantly. If you had known I was the owner's mother, you would have been polite. You would have smiled and stepped out of my way. But because you thought I was just a janitor, you felt entitled to treat me like trash. You called me filthy. You told me I belonged in the streets. Does a person's worth change based on their job title, doctor? Or is it only the people with power who deserve your respect? David stepped up beside me, placing a supportive hand on my shoulder. My mother has worked in this hospital for 15 years by choice, David said to the room, but his eyes were locked on Vane. She wanted to stay connected to the work. She wanted to see how this hospital actually functioned from the ground up. She's given more to this institution than you will in a lifetime of surgeries. And you had the audacity to use a racial slur and fire her because you didn't like the way she looked in your hallway. Vane's eyes darted toward the board members. I never used a slur. I just said, one of the interns who had been in the lounge, a young man who had clearly found his courage, stood up from the back of the room, where he had been summoned as a witness. Actually, doctor, you did. I heard you. We all heard you. The final nail was driven into the coffin. Vane looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. He had come into this room expecting a promotion, expecting to be heralded as the next great thing in medicine. Instead, he was standing in the wreckage of his own making. He had built his inner identity on a foundation of superiority, and today that foundation had crumbled. David looked at his watch, then back at Vane. Dr. Vane, you mentioned earlier that you refuse to work in a building that employs people like my mother. It seems we finally agree on something, because as of this moment you no longer work here. Security is waiting outside to escort you to your locker. You have 10 minutes to clear out your desk, and don't bother looking for a recommendation. I'll be personally making sure the medical board receives a full report of your conduct today. The sound of the word terminated seemed to echo against the high ceilings of the boardroom. Dr. Julian Vane stood there, paralyzed, as if his brain was struggling to process a reality where he wasn't the protagonist. His hands, usually so steady during surgery, were now visibly trembling at his sides. He looked at David, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading light. Dr. Vance, please, you can't be serious, he stammered, his voice cracking. I've performed 3 successful bypasses this week alone. My record is flawless. You're going to throw away a surgeon of my caliber over a disagreement with the cleaning staff? He still couldn't bring himself to say the word mother with any real respect. Even in his moment of total defeat, his ego was trying to bargain, trying to weigh his surgical skills against a human soul. David leaned forward, his hands flat on the table, his face a mask of cold iron. A disagreement, Julian. You didn't have a disagreement. You showed me, this board and every staff member in this hospital, exactly who you are when you think no one of importance is watching. Here at St. Jude's, we believe that the character of a doctor is just as important as the precision of his scalpel. If you can't treat the woman who cleans your floor with basic human decency, how can I trust you to care for a patient who is unconscious and vulnerable on your table? David's voice grew louder, filling every corner of the room. You are not just a surgeon. You are a representative of this institution. And frankly, your caliber is not something we want associated with the Vance name. I watched Vane's face crumble. The realization was finally sinking in. There was no way out. No amount of prestige. No Ivy League degree. and no successful surgery could save him from the consequences of his own prejudice. He turned his gaze to me, perhaps hoping to find a spark of maternal mercy. "Mrs. Vance, Martha, please." I was stressed, the pressure of the new wing, the move. I didn't mean those things. It was a lapse in judgment. I'm sure you, of all people, understand what it's like to have a hard day. He forced a weak, pathetic smile, his voice dripping with a newfound, hollow humility. It was the most disgusting thing I had seen all day. A man who only apologized because he had been caught, not because he was sorry. I stood up from my chair and walked slowly around the table until I was standing directly in front of him. I was shorter than him, but in that moment I felt like a mountain looking down at a grain of sand. "A hard day, doctor. I've had 15 years of hard days," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "I've worked through illnesses, through the loss of my husband, and through the exhaustion of raising a son on a janitor's wage. And in all those 15 years, I never once used my hard day as an excuse to belittle another human being. You didn't have a lapse in judgment. You had a revelation of character. You saw someone you perceived as lower than you, and you chose to be a bully. You chose to be a bigot. That isn't stress, Julian. That's who you are." The board members remained silent, some nodding in agreement, others looking down at their laps, unable to face the truth of what they had allowed to persist in their hospital. Vane looked around the room one last time, seeing only closed doors and turned backs. The arrogance that had fueled his stride into the room had completely evaporated, leaving behind a small, frightened man who had gambled his future on the belief that he was untouchable. "Get out," David said, the finality in his voice like a gavel striking wood. "Security is waiting. If you're not off the premises in 10 minutes, I'll have you removed for trespassing, just as you threatened to do to my mother." Vane didn't say another word. He turned and walked toward the doors, but his gait was different now. The confident click of his heels was gone. He walked with a heavy, dragging step, his shoulders slumped. As he reached the exit, the two security guards, Marcus and Terence, were already there, waiting for him. They didn't say anything, but the look of quiet satisfaction on their faces spoke volumes. They fell in step behind him, escorting the great Dr. Julian Vane out of the executive suite and down toward the basement locker rooms he had so recently mocked. It was a walk of shame that would be talked about in every break room, every operating theater, and every hallway of the hospital for years to come. As the doors closed behind them, a heavy silence settled over the boardroom. David took a deep breath and turned to the rest of the members. "This meeting is adjourned for 30 minutes, he announced. "I suggest you all take this time to reflect on the culture we've allowed to fester here. My mother didn't just spend 15 years cleaning these floors. She spent 15 years watching us, and if she felt she had to hide her identity to see the truth of how we treat our most essential workers, then we have failed as leaders." The board members scrambled to leave, exiting through the side doors, leaving David and me alone in the vast, quiet room. David walked over to me, the CEO facade finally dropping completely. He reached out and took my hands in his. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry you had to hear those things." I squeezed his hands, feeling the strength in them. "Don't be sorry, David. I've heard those things before, and I'll probably hear them again. But today, for the first time, the person saying them actually had to face the mirror." I looked around the room, at the expensive art and the gleaming table. I'm glad I did it. I'm glad I stayed just a janitor for as long as I did. It kept me grounded and it kept me honest, but I think it's finally time to put the mop down. David smiled, a tear glistening in his eye. "I think you've earned that, Mom. But before we go home, there's one more thing we need to do. The hospital staff needs to know that the woman they've known as Martha is much more than they ever imagined." David led me out of the boardroom, but we didn't head for the private executive elevator. Instead, he steered me toward the main bank of elevators. The ones used by the surgeons, the nurses, and the families holding their breath for good news. As we stood there waiting for the doors to open, I caught my reflection in the polished brass. I looked like a stranger to myself. The woman in the black silk blouse and heels had the same eyes as the woman in the blue scrubs, but the weight on her shoulders had shifted. It wasn't the weight of a mop anymore. It was the weight of a legacy. David kept his arm firmly around my shoulders. A silent declaration to anyone who might be watching that I was his greatest pride. When the elevator arrived at the third-floor surgical wing, the doors opened to a scene of hushed chaos. News travels through a hospital faster than a heartbeat. People were huddled in small groups, whispering frantically. They had seen Dr. Vane being marched out by security, his face a ghostly mask of defeat. They had heard the rumors about the janitor and the CEO. When David and I stepped out together, the hallway went silent. It was a silence so profound you could hear the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. Nurses paused mid-chart, orderlies stopped their carts, and residents froze in their tracks. They looked at David, their formidable, brilliant leader. And then they looked at me. David didn't stop at the nursing station. He walked directly to the center of the hub, where the intercom system was located. He pressed the button that broadcasted to the entire surgical and maintenance wings. "Attention, staff," David's voice boomed, calm but infused with an authority that commanded absolute attention. "I am sure many of you have witnessed the events of the last hour. As of 2:15 p.m. today, Dr. Julian Vane has been terminated for gross professional misconduct and violations of our core ethics. This hospital was founded on the principle that every life has equal value, and that includes the lives of the people who keep these doors open and these floors clean." He paused, looking around the circle of faces. I saw Sarah, the head nurse, standing near the back. She was beaming, her eyes watery with joy. I saw the younger janitors, the ones I had mentored, looking on with wide, disbelieving eyes. David turned to me, pulling me closer. "For 15 years, this hospital has been blessed by a woman who chose to serve in the most humble way possible. She didn't do it because she had to. She did it because she believed in the mission of this institution. She is the primary benefactor of the Vance Trust, a member of our board, and she is my mother, Martha Higgins Vance. From this day forward, things are going to change. We will no longer be a place where a title determines your level of respect." A ripple of motion went through the crowd, and it started with Sarah, who began to clap, and then one by one, the nurses and the residents joined in. It wasn't just a polite applause. It was a release of tension, a celebration of a hidden truth finally coming to light. I felt a lump form in my throat. I had spent 15 years being the invisible woman, the one people stepped over or ignored, to be seen, truly seen, by the people I had worked alongside for so long was overwhelming. I stepped forward, taking the microphone from David. My hand trembled slightly, but my voice was clear. "I have spent many years in these hallways," I said, looking at the familiar faces. "I know who works hard when the supervisors aren't looking. I know who speaks kindly to the lonely patients in the middle of the night. And I also know who thinks they are too big for the small acts of kindness that make a hospital a place of healing. My son and I are going to ensure that this hospital rewards the heart as much as the hand. To those of you who treated me with respect when you thought I was just a cleaner, thank you. To those who didn't, well, you have a lot of work to do." I looked toward the maintenance closet where my old cart was still parked, a silent sentinel of my past life. "I'm retiring from my position as a member of the environmental services team today," I continued, a small smile playing on my lips. "But I am not leaving the hospital. I will be taking my seat on the board of directors actively now, and my first order of business will be a complete review of our staff treatment and sensitivity protocols." We are a family here, and in a family, no one is filthy, and no one is trash. We all bleed the same color, and we all deserve to walk these halls with our heads held high. As I handed the microphone back to David, a young janitor named Leo, whom I had taught how to wax the floors just last month, stepped forward. He looked nervous but determined. "Mrs. Vance," Leo called out. I nodded at him. Does this mean we can finally get those new floor buffers we asked for? The ones that don't hurt our backs so much?" A laugh broke out among the staff, breaking the heavy solemnity of the moment. I smiled warmly at him. "Leo, not only are you getting the new buffers, but you're also getting a significant cost of living increase in your next paycheck. It's long overdue." The cheer that went up then was louder than any applause. David laughed, hugging me tight. We began to walk through the crowd, and for the first time in 15 years, I didn't have to move out of anyone's way. They moved for me, not out of fear, but out of a newfound, profound respect. As David and I walked through the surgical wing, the atmosphere felt as though a heavy fog had finally lifted. For years, there had been a subtle, unspoken divide in this hospital, a glass ceiling that separated those in white coats from those in blue scrubs. But today that glass had been shattered. I could see it in the way the junior nurses stood a little taller, and the way the kitchen staff, peeking through the swinging doors of the cafeteria, whispered to one another with smiles on their faces. The story of Dr. Vane's downfall and my ascension was spreading like wildfire. It wasn't just about a janitor being the CEO's mother. It was about the fact that the most powerful person in the building had once been the person who scrubbed the toilets. We reached David's private office, a sanctuary of glass and mahogany that overlooked the city skyline. He closed the door, leaning his back against it and letting out a long, weary sigh. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. That was a lot to handle in one afternoon. I sat down in one of the leather armchairs, feeling the soft texture against my skin. "I'm more than okay, David. I feel like I can finally breathe." I didn't realize how much of a burden that secret was until I didn't have to carry it anymore. I looked at my son, seeing the man he had become. A man of integrity, a man who hadn't forgotten where he came from, despite the titles and the accolades. "You know," David said, walking over to the window, "Vane isn't the only one. He was just the loudest. There are others in this hospital who have forgotten that medicine is a service, not a social club. I've been trying to change the culture from the top down, but I think your way was more effective. You changed it from the inside out." He turned back to me, a determined look in his eyes. "I want to start an endowment in your name, Mom. The Martha Higgins Vance Scholarship for Service Excellence. It won't be for the best surgeons or the highest grades. It will be for the staff members, from any department, who show the most compassion and respect to their colleagues and patients." I felt a tear prick at the corner of my eye. "That would be beautiful, David. Truly beautiful. But I want one more thing." He tilted his head, curious. "Anything. You know that." I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the street level, where people were rushing about their lives, oblivious to the drama unfolding above them. "I want a seat on the hiring committee for all senior medical staff. I want to look into the eyes of every brilliant surgeon we bring into this building. I want to see if they see me, or if they just see a barrier to their own ego. We cannot allow another Julian Vane to walk these halls." David nodded firmly. "Consider it done. Your insight is more valuable than any HR screening we currently have." Just then, a soft knock came at the door. David's assistant, Claire, the one who had been so shocked in the lobby, peeked her head in. She looked hesitant, almost shy. "Excuse me, Dr. Vance. Mrs. Vance? I'm sorry to disturb you, but there are several members of the local press calling. Apparently, one of the interns leaked the story on social media. It's already gone viral. They're calling it the Janitor Queen of St. Jude's." I couldn't help but chuckle at the nickname. It was a bit dramatic, but it had a certain ring to it. David looked at me, a questioning brow raised. "Do you want to talk to them, We can shut it down if you want your privacy. I thought about it for a moment. For 15 years I had cherished my privacy, finding safety in my invisibility. But if my story could change the way people looked at the invisible workers in their own lives, the janitors, the bus drivers, the maids, then perhaps it was a story worth telling. Let them wait for a few hours, I said. I want to go back down to the maintenance break room first. I have 15 years of stuff in that locker, and I want to say a proper goodbye to the people who were my only friends in this building for a long time. David walked me back to the elevators. This time, when we reached the basement, the air didn't feel damp or oppressive. It felt like a place of history. I walked into the maintenance break room, a small room with a flickering fluorescent light and a mismatched set of plastic chairs. 5 of my colleagues were there, sitting around the scratched table with cups of lukewarm coffee. When I entered, they all stood up at once. There was a moment of awkwardness, a realization that the woman they had shared complaints with was now technically their boss. But I didn't let that silence last. "Sit down, everyone," I said, pulling out a chair. "I'm still Martha, and I still think the coffee in this basement is the worst in the city." They laughed and the tension broke. For the next hour, we didn't talk about CEOs or boards of directors. We talked about our families, about the aches in our backs, and about the small victories of the day. They told me how much it meant to them to see one of their own stand up to someone like Vane. "He made us feel like ghosts, Martha," Leo said, his voice thick with emotion. "Like we didn't even exist. Today you made us feel like giants." As I emptied my locker, taking the photo of David and the small mementos I had gathered over the years, I realized that my work here wasn't finished. It was just changing shape. I was moving from the floors to the board, but I was taking the basement with me. David met me in the lobby, his face a mixture of amusement and irritation. "He's still out there, Mom, sitting in his silver Porsche, telling anyone with a camera that he's the victim of a conspiracy. He's even claiming that you weren't actually cleaning floors, but were spying on behalf of the board." I looked out the glass doors of the lobby. A few local news vans had already arrived, their satellite dishes extending toward the sky like hungry metal flowers. Dr. Vane was standing by his car, gesturing wildly at a reporter. He looked disheveled, his expensive hair out of place, the mask of the perfect surgeon completely shattered. "Let him talk," I said calmly. "The more he talks, the more he reveals the very heart we've been discussing. He thinks the truth is a matter of perspective, but he forgot that there are witnesses." I turned to David. "Does he realize that the VIP lounge where he insulted me has high-definition security cameras? The kind we installed last year to protect the high-profile patients?" David's eyes lit up. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "I forgot about the audio-visual upgrades in that wing. We don't just have witnesses, Mom. We have a full recording of his little speech about people of your kind." We walked toward the security office, a small room filled with monitors that displayed every inch of St. Jude's. The head of security, a retired police officer named Gary, was already pulling up the footage. "Here it is, Mrs. Vance," Gary said, his voice grim. He hit play. On the screen, I saw myself, a small figure in blue, diligently wiping down the glass tables. Then, Dr. Vane entered. The audio was crystal clear. We heard every word. We heard the vitriol in his voice when he called me filthy. We heard the racial undertone when he told me I belonged in the streets. Most importantly, we heard him admit that he was firing me based on my appearance and race rather than my performance. "That's it," David whispered. "That's his career, not just here, but anywhere." He looked at me, waiting for my permission. "What do you want to do with this? We could hand it to our legal team and settle this in a dark room, or we can show the world what happens when you bring hate into a place of healing." I looked at the screen, at the woman who had worked so hard for so long. I didn't want revenge, but I did want accountability. If we swept this under the rug, we were telling every other Dr. Vane out there that they could buy their way out of being a decent human being. "Show them," I said, "but not in a way that fuels a scandal. Use it as a training tool. Post the statement from the hospital board and include the findings of the internal investigation. Let the medical board decide his future. David nodded and made a call. Within 30 minutes, the official St. Jude's Memorial Hospital social media accounts posted a formal statement regarding the termination of a staff member for ethics violations. They didn't name him directly at first, but they cited recorded evidence of racial discrimination and harassment. Outside, the mood changed instantly. The reporters who had been listening to Vane's sob story about being trapped by an eccentric billionaire's mother suddenly received the alerts on their phones. One reporter stepped forward and held up her tablet to Vane, asking him to comment on the documented evidence of his slurs. Vane's face turned a shade of purple I had never seen before. He looked at the tablet, then at the hospital doors, and finally, he saw us. David and I were standing behind the glass, watching. He realized then that he wasn't just losing a job, he was losing his reputation, his license, and his standing in society. He didn't wait for another question. He scrambled into his car, the tires screeching as he sped out of the parking lot, nearly hitting a news van in his desperation to escape the cameras. The hero had fled. The silence that followed in the lobby was peaceful. It was the sound of a wound finally being cleaned. David put his arm around me. "He's gone, Mom, and I've already received 3 calls from other department heads asking how they can help with the Service Excellence Fund. You've started something big." I leaned my head on his shoulder. "I didn't start it, David. You did, by being the man I raised you to be. I just finished the cleaning." The days following Dr. Vane's departure felt like a collective exhale for the entire staff of St. Jude's Memorial. It wasn't just that a toxic presence was gone. It was as if a new light had been turned on in the darker corners of the hospital. I spent that first week transitioning from my locker in the basement to my new office on the executive floor, a room that felt far too large and quiet after years of the bustling service corridors. However, I didn't spend much time behind the desk. My heart was still in the hallways. I spent my mornings walking the floors, no longer with a mop in my hand, but with a notebook and a genuine interest in the people I met. I spoke to the laundry workers about the heat in the basement. I spoke to the cafeteria staff about the quality of the food, and I spoke to the junior residents who were often too afraid to voice their exhaustion. The Janitor Queen story had indeed gone viral, but the narrative had shifted from a sensational scandal to a profound conversation about class and respect in the workplace. I was flooded with letters from across the country, messages from hotel maids, sanitation workers, and retail clerks who felt seen for the first time in their lives. They saw my story as their own, a reminder that the person serving them was a person with a history, a family, and a dream. At the hospital, David and I launched the Dignity in Service initiative. It wasn't just a catchy title, it was a policy overhaul. We restructured the pay scales for the support staff, ensuring that no one who worked 40 hours a week at St. Jude's lived below the poverty line. We established a mentorship program where senior surgeons would spend a day shadowing the maintenance team, and vice versa. The first surgery after the incident was a test of this new culture. A renowned neurosurgeon, Dr. Aris, was scheduled for a complex 10-hour procedure. In the past, the room would have been cleared of non-essential staff as quickly as possible. But this time, before the first incision was made, Dr. Aris paused. He looked at the cleaning crew who had just finished sterilizing the room, and he looked at the nurses and the technicians. He thanked the maintenance team by name for ensuring the environment was safe for his patient. It was a small gesture, but the way those workers walked out of that room, shoulders back, heads held high, proved that the culture was, indeed, shifting. However, the shadow of Julian Vane hadn't completely vanished. His lawyers were still attempting to claw back a settlement, claiming that the release of the security footage was a violation of his privacy. But they were fighting a losing battle. The medical board had opened an inquiry into his past behavior at previous clinics, and more stories began to emerge. It turned out I wasn't the first person he had belittled. I was simply the first one with the power to push back. We discovered that he had a history of correcting the records of nurses who disagreed with him and pushing out junior doctors of color. He wasn't just a man who had a bad day. He was a man who had built a career on the backs of those he deemed inferior. Seeing the evidence pile up was a somber reminder of why I had stayed undercover for so long. You can't fix a leak in the roof if you don't know where the water is coming from. One afternoon, David came into my office with a thick folder. He looked tired but satisfied. "The medical board made their decision, Mom," he said, sitting on the edge of my desk. "Julian Vane's license has been suspended indefinitely. They cited a pattern of discriminatory behavior and ethical violations incompatible with the practice of medicine. He won't be practicing in this state, or likely any other, for a very long time." I felt a sense of closure, but not the joy I thought I might feel. It was sad that a man with so much talent had wasted it on hate. "He had the hands of a healer, but the heart of a gatekeeper," I said softly. David nodded. He forgot the first rule of medicine: do no harm. And harm isn't just what you do with a knife, it's what you do with your words. As the month drew to a close, we prepared for the first annual Martha Higgins Vance Service Awards. We decided to hold the ceremony in the main lobby, the very place where I had spent so many years buffing the floors. We set up a stage over the tiles I knew so well. I insisted that the front rows be reserved for the maintenance, security, and nursing staff. The donors and executives sat behind them. It was a visual representation of the new St. Jude's. When I stood up to speak, looking out at the sea of faces, I didn't see employees or subordinates. I saw the lifeblood of the community. I saw people who had stood by me when I was just Martha, and people who were now learning to see the world through a wider lens. I looked at the gold-embossed plaque in my hand, ready to present it to the first recipient, Leo, the young janitor who had been so brave in the boardroom. I realized that my 15 years of hiding weren't a waste of time. They were the most important years of my life. They taught me that true power doesn't come from a title or a bank account. It comes from the ability to see the humanity in everyone, regardless of the uniform they wear. As I called Leo's name and the lobby erupted in a standing ovation that shook the very walls of the hospital, I knew that the foundation of St. Jude's was finally as strong as the people who stood upon it. We weren't just a hospital anymore. We were a sanctuary of respect. The ceremony in the lobby felt like the closing of one chapter and the breathtaking start of another. As Leo walked up the stage to receive his award, his face was a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated pride. He shook my hand and, for a moment, we were just two people who knew the specific weight of a waterlogged mop and the sting of floor stripper on a long shift. But as he turned to the microphone, he didn't talk about the work. He talked about feeling human. "For the first time," Leo said, his voice echoing through the atrium, "I don't feel like I'm just part of the machinery. I feel like I'm part of the cure." Those words stayed with me long after the crowd dispersed and the chairs were folded away. In the weeks that followed, my life settled into a new rhythm. I still arrived at the hospital early, but now I entered through the front doors, greeted by the security team with warm smiles and genuine good mornings. I spent my days in board meetings, ensuring that our budget prioritized people over prestige, and my afternoons in the wards, visiting patients who had no one else to talk to. I became a bridge between the world of the elite and the world of the essential. David and I grew closer than ever. We often shared dinner in his office, looking out at the city lights, talking about how to make St. Jude's a model for hospitals across the country. We weren't just saving lives, we were changing the way those lives were valued. One rainy Tuesday, I found myself walking past the fourth-floor VIP lounge. It had been refurbished recently, with warmer colors and more comfortable seating. I stopped at the exact spot where Dr. Vane had once stood, where he had looked at me with such venom and told me I was filthy. The memory didn't hurt anymore. It felt distant, like a scene from a movie I had watched a long time ago. As I stood there, a new intern, a young woman of color with bright, eager eyes, rushed past me, nearly tripping over her own feet. She stopped, looked at me, and smiled. "Oh, excuse me, Mrs. Vance. I'm so sorry. I'm running late for a rotation." I smiled back, reaching out to steady her. "It's quite all right, doctor. Take a breath. The hospital isn't going anywhere, and neither are you." She thanked me and hurried on, her white coat fluttering behind her like a cape. I looked down at the floor. It was spotless, reflecting the soft amber lights of the ceiling. A member of the evening cleaning crew was working nearby, a man I hadn't met yet. He was focused on his task, moving with a steady, rhythmic grace. I walked over to him. He looked up, a bit startled to see a board member approaching him. "It looks beautiful," I said, gesturing to the floor. He wiped his brow and smiled. "Thank you, ma'am. I try to make it shine. You never know who's walking on it, right?" I laughed softly, a deep, contented sound. "You're absolutely right. You never know whose life you're making better, just by being here." I reached into my pocket and handed him one of my cards. Not my board member card, but a small token we had created for the Service Excellence program. "Keep up the great work. You are seen and you are appreciated." As I walked toward the exit that evening, I realized that Dr. Julian Vane had given me a gift, though he never intended to. By trying to take away my dignity, he had forced me to claim it in a way that empowered thousands of others. He thought he was removing a stain, but he ended up revealing a diamond. St. Jude's Memorial was no longer just a place of medicine. It was a place of transformation. My son had his name on the building, but I had my heart in the foundation, and as long as I was there, no one would ever be just a janitor again. We are all keepers of the light in our own way, and when we stand together, no shadow, no matter how dark or arrogant, can ever truly diminish our shine. I stepped out into the cool evening air, looking up at the glowing red cross atop the hospital. I was Martha Higgins Vance. I had been a janitor for 15 years, and it was the proudest work I had ever done. Thank you for joining us today on Dr. Harmony. This story reminds us that true status isn't found in a title, but in how we treat those who can do nothing for us. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to Dr. Harmony for more powerful stories of justice and inspiration. Your support helps us keep sharing these messages of hope and humanity with the world. Until next time, remember to see the person, not the uniform. See you in the next video.